Well, it's certainly always a good day. We can start with good news. And I must admit, I was just feeling a little overwhelmed as we were singing earlier. I think the idea that I feel like the Lord brought to me was, isn't it amazing to think that we're not here because of anything that we've done? I mean, it was a humbling thought for me. I'm sure perhaps that thought has crossed our mind before, but isn't it amazing? We have good news to celebrate every day. I was thinking of those lines we sang from How Great Is Your Love. And paraphrasing them, it's that Jesus came for us, came to save us. We are amazed, we stand in awe, we have been saved by the power of the cross. That is good news. That is good news for us to carry with us every day. And I love that we're gathered here worshiping God. He is worthy of that. But we also have some other good news to share. A lot of things actually have happened this week. One thing to celebrate in our house is that we have a newly engaged couple. Bryce and Carly are now engaged. We celebrate that. We're excited for the next steps in their journey. We have a new baby in the Klein family. Baby Klein arrived on early Saturday morning, very early Saturday morning. Family's doing well. Everybody's doing great. So I'm sure we'll get more updates, but that's amazing. Got a birthday in the house today. Jacob, birthday, yeah. And I must admit, Steve mentioned the block party. It was amazing. I got to give a shout out to Josh. Trooper, dunk tank the whole time. Nobody subbed him out. I don't know. Nobody subbed him out. But it was good. So good, so good. It's great to share together in good news. Today, I just want to start by giving you a little glimpse into my own life. Maybe you know this about me already, but I would say in general, I'm a pretty detail-oriented person. Probably, potentially, sometimes to a fault. And obviously, I'm not perfect in that. I'm not nailing every single detail on everything every time. And perhaps sometimes I'm a little too focused maybe on a particular detail or something in particular. But I would say just kind of in general, as I live my life, I find it valuable to pay attention to some of those details. I think it's important, and I think it can make people feel valued and welcomed. We're about to kick off the school year. Many of you know I'm a fourth grade teacher, and one of my goals, I try to do it on the very first day, is to know all my kids' names. So this year, right now, that'll be about 40 kids, 2 different classes that I see in the day. And really, I make it my goal by the end of the first day to be able to look at that student and say, hey, you are so-and-so. And I think that is something that makes them feel valued. Now, in the world of details, I was thinking about this as well. I know that when I started dating Lauren, as I was learning more about her, when I would hear something that I thought, oh, this might be a little bit important, I might want to remember that, I would start typing in a little note on my phone. I don't know, she probably found it on my phone already, who knows. It still exists, I still got it on here, I didn't delete it, because I'm sure someday I may forget some of these things. But it was interesting to kind of look over, I jotted down things about her family, things that I thought, hey, this might be a good place to go based on what I'm learning about her interests. But interestingly enough, really, if I were to give just a really quick summary, there's a lot of things about food on there. So I don't know what that says about our relationship exactly, but just for your own knowledge, I mean, she's not a really picky eater. She's got a little bit of a sweet tooth, but here's her no-no list. No anchovies, no olives. So there you go, just in case you ever need to know that. But details, I started thinking about that because as I was reading this week's passage, it was just one detail that kind of hooked me in this week. We're going to visit Nehemiah. And the detail that I had never been aware of before, or it had never been brought to my attention, I read from a commentator, and it just landed firmly for me. It amazed me because we're going to look at a prayer that Nehemiah prays. And as we look at the text, we're going to see that Nehemiah was in the midst of, he was about ready to approach the king to make a really bold request. But what I had never known before is that Nehemiah had spent 4 months in prayer. And that just kind of stopped me in my tracks. That was a detail that I had never heard before, but it just kind of sunk in thinking, look at what Nehemiah, look at the step that he took before he was ready to take this important step. He spent days and months in prayer. He turned to God first. And I think that alone for me, that's enough for me to carry with me, to chew on, to keep thinking about for a lifetime. Turning to God first. That was the detail that hooked me in. But here's what we know about Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a Jewish exile. He was still actually living in Babylon 150 years after the fall of Jerusalem. And he's actually risen to a pretty prominent position in the king's court. It's King Artaxerxes that he's serving in the Persian Empire. And he's in a position of privilege and responsibility. But we can see pretty quickly as we jump into Nehemiah that truly his heart is with his fellow Israelites. Now we know, 2 weeks ago we looked at Ezra, we know that there were some Israelites who had already started to return to Jerusalem. Some of them with Ezra, that was in 458 BC. But 13 years later, Nehemiah gets this report. He hears about Jerusalem. And we can see from his response, he's crushed. His heart is broken. He says this, he says, here's the report first. Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, this is now his response, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And now we get that little timestamp. If you actually read all of chapter 1 and you go into chapter 2, you'll see some months mentioned. And so we get the clarity that Nehemiah spent months praying before he was about to approach the king with a very important request. And again, for me, and I think it's valuable for each of us, simply knowing that Nehemiah turned to God first and he spent all of this time in prayer and preparation. It was enough to convict me and to think that we absolutely have something to draw from this that we can apply to our lives. And I think it's this. It's when we turn to God first, we can understand God's will and be confident in God's power. Nehemiah, in his response, there was certainly distress in his response. But it wasn't this response of distress and then deflection. In other words, we don't get this idea that Nehemiah thought, well, you know what, this is really sad, this is heartbreaking news, but I'm sure at some point somebody else is going to take care of it. Maybe, who knows, maybe the government will actually realize it. It would be a good thing to rebuild this wall. It will be taken care of at some point. But actually, in reality, King Artaxerxes, the king that Nehemiah was serving, had already previously stopped the rebuilding in Jerusalem. And it made me think, reflecting on my own life, I thought about times where I know that I deflect sometimes. Sometimes in a distressing or an unfortunate situation, I try to deflect. Maybe I don't want to accept all of the responsibility. I think of perhaps preparing for a race. If I decide I'm going to run a race, and I know it's a 5K, half marathon, whatever it may be, and I know I need to get some training in, well, what I like to do is I like to try to plan plan in advance if I can, try to determine how many miles am I going to run, what specific workouts am I going to do. I want to prepare my body. And so if I find this plan, I map it out, and I decide, all right, I'm going for it, I'm hopping on board, and I check the items off the list, I get my miles in, and I'm ready to go for the race. And then on that race day, results aren't so great. Doesn't turn out so well. Generally, my first thought isn't, man, you just really blew it on that day. I often say, it was that plan didn't work. If I'm going to do this again, I'm going to have to try something else. I mean, maybe we could think of it in terms of investments. Literally, we could think of investing money, but you could think of investing your time, other resources. Think about it. If you follow the recommended plan, we'll call it, for that investment, you follow the steps and you have this expected outcome, and then things fall apart. What might we say? We might say, it was that plan. It was a bad plan. The plan didn't work. And so I think we have some, I'm just going to call them systems. We have these systems that we put our trust in. And oftentimes, I'm certainly not knocking all of these systems because there are valuable processes, steps that we can take to grow and learn. Those things can certainly happen and they can be valuable. But as I was reading through Nehemiah, this is the thought that came to the forefront for me. If we're in a relationship with God, it's not about trusting a system. It's about trusting the Spirit. And in Nehemiah, we have an amazing example of how committed to God's will Nehemiah is. I think especially, we're going to read through his prayer in just a moment, we can see the confidence Nehemiah has in the power of God, that he will be faithful to his promises. And again, I think we can find this reminder simply in knowing Nehemiah's first step. It was to turn to God, to spend time in prayer, months in prayer. This prayer shows his confidence in God's power. I'm going to read through it here. This is verses 5 through 11. This is Nehemiah's prayer. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We've not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. If you spend a moment just kind of looking at some of the details of this prayer, we'll notice Nehemiah starts this prayer with praise for God's greatness, for his loyal love for his people. And you might recognize as well, we looked at a prayer from Ezra 2 weeks ago. Ezra did the same thing that Nehemiah does. He acknowledges that the Israelites have been guilty of sinning against God. He confesses himself. He includes him in this. And then he speaks of God's promise to restore his people to that promised land if they were a people who repented. In verse 10, we see Nehemiah. He notes that these are the people that the Lord had redeemed. They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and mighty hand. They had been redeemed from Egyptian slavery to continue to carry out God's purpose. And then as the prayer closes, we know that Nehemiah is getting ready to petition the king, and he prays that that would be successful. And when we turn to God first, we can recall these promises of God. We can understand God's will. We can be confident in God's power. And I'm hopeful that maybe this passage today, it causes us to reflect on our own lives as believers on the importance of prayer and the role that it plays in helping us live out God's purposes. And I think about it in the context of the church, the body of Christ, and I was thinking through this, and it just so happened one of the days when I opened my Bible app, the verse of the day, it stuck out to me to fit into our conversation today. And in 1 Corinthians 12, it says this: there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. And as I thought about this and how powerful the church can be as a united body to share the gospel message, I was thinking really about the last couple weeks. I thought about what Ezra was praying, some of the words from Jeremiah that Steve led us through last week, and I thought about Nehemiah's prayer, and it just kind of landed here to think about in our own lives. Are we turning to God first? Do we turn to God first? We see this from Nehemiah. He was completely putting his faith in God. Last week from Jeremiah, Steve was talking about even if we're in a place that's not our home, and let's be honest, that's true for us. We're not in a place that's our home. Our citizenship is in heaven. Even if we're not in our home, we should want the land and the people to be blessed and prosper. We should be thinking not just of our brothers and sisters in Christ. We should be thinking about our enemies, those in positions of authority, and praying beyond ourselves. Nehemiah was praying because he wanted to fulfill God's purposes. And as believers, we want to share the love of Christ with as many people as we can. And so, I want to challenge us to think about, firstly, again, are we turning to God first? And as we turn to God in prayer, are we praying beyond ourselves? Now, as cupbearer to the king, if you finish reading chapter 1, you'll see that last little line. I was cupbearer to the king. This is Nehemiah's official position. And we can expect a few things based on historical knowledge of this position. Some things that were probably true about Nehemiah. He would have been trained in court etiquette, being in the king's court. He would certainly know, as the cupbearer, he would know how to select the wines that would be put in front of the king. He would be expected to be a lively, a friendly companion to the king, someone who would be ready to listen to the king whenever needed. He would also have a lot of influence, because he would be a person that would have very close access to the king. In fact, he might be one of the people helping to determine who's going to see the king. And Nehemiah would have had the unreserved confidence of the king. And I think some of these details are important because it's important for us to know Nehemiah had expectations and responsibilities to uphold in this position. And he was about to make a request to the king. He was going to ask the king for permission to return to Jerusalem to help be a part of rebuilding the walls. And remember, this was a king who had already stopped once the rebuilding in Jerusalem. And so what we learn, if you travel into chapter 2, Nehemiah, he enters into the presence of the king, but the king notes there's this look of sadness on his face. And it's quite possible Nehemiah was rather fearful, because Maybe Artaxerxes was going to interpret this sadness in his presence as dissatisfaction with the king. And if the king thought Nehemiah was dissatisfied with him, then it very well could have influenced the king's response to what Nehemiah was about to request, to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild these walls that had been destroyed about 150 years ago when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem, burned the temple, carried most of the remaining Jews off to Babylon, and knocked the walls down. And again, from a couple weeks ago, we know there were exiles. They were returning. They had received permission. They had rebuilt the temple. But there was certainly a need to rebuild these city walls. There was a need to be able to defend themselves because there would certainly be people who wanted to interfere with the Israelites' way of life. They were now returning and they had the chance to worship God freely. And so they needed a fortified city. This was something really important for the Israelites to take care of. And even with this big ask that was about to happen, I can't help but stop and think about Nehemiah's approach. One step at a time. What did he do first? He turned to God in prayer. And then, after months of praying, he approached the king. And I think it's important for us to consider this course of action and to recognize that for us as well, we can take one step of faith at a time. And I think that's a valuable reminder for us in the midst of a fast-paced world. I know I'm guilty myself of getting caught up in it, but often we look around, we see in our culture that people strive to get recognized by progressing as quickly as possible. They're trying to get from one level to another, to another, to another. Solve this problem, you bump up, and solve another problem, and you keep going, and you keep going. And it's an honor in many cases to have a long list of accomplishments or accolades attached to your name. And so I think it's valuable for us to consider what it looks like to trust God one step at a time. And the phrase that came to my mind as I was thinking through this, I thought about putting the cart before the horse. You've probably heard that phrase before. But I'm going to call it a classic example. Maybe it's not. But the example that came to my mind is one of parents and children. Maybe this is a cart before the horse moment, and maybe some of you have personally experienced this, but I thought of the first snow. First snow starts laying, it starts actually collecting. Hey, we can go out and play in this snow. And of course, as good parents, what are good parents going to do? They are going to bundle up their youngster, and they're going to get layer and layer and layer and layer and boots and the snow pants and the warm jacket and the gloves and the hat and everything. And they are excited. Snow angels are coming. Snowmen are coming. Maybe a snowball fight. Who knows? They are pumped. And so all the preparation goes into it. And then what does the youngster say? We've got some parents in here. I got to go to the bathroom. Or maybe you then decide, before we go out, maybe I better ask. We could have solved that problem. I could have just asked before we got everybody all bundled up. But sometimes we're good at putting the cart before the horse. Sometimes we get this immediate vision. We have this excitement. We're enthusiastic because we think we can solve a problem or take the next step. Sometimes it leads to another problem, though. And that's certainly not to knock having a vision or enthusiasm, but I think we need to consider the source of that. Are we relying on ourselves? In that case, we may find problems, road bumps ahead. Or are we relying on God? Because if we've given our lives to Jesus, we can trust God in every step of the journey. We can rely on Him for wisdom, for strength, for clarity, because for those who love God, He works in all things for their good according to his purpose. And so I just want to encourage us to carry this question with us. This is not just a Sunday question. This is not just a this week question. This is a question for us in our journey of faith. What is the next step of faith God is calling you to take? And at Merge Community Church, this is a part of our mission. We want this to be a regular part of conversation as the body. We want to encourage and to help people to be able to take that next step of faith to grow in your relationship with God. It's encouraging to step into those conversations and to get to a level where you can trust a brother or a sister and ask them, what is it? What is God calling you to do next to build his kingdom? And we talk about having unique gifts in the body. We know it's true, and what a better example than the block party yesterday. I mean, many hands and many hours and many moments of exerting energy to bring that to fruition. Each person doing their part. And we know, as we've already prayed over, we can trust God to put people in those people's lives, to water seeds, to help them grow. Maybe we'll see connections even here at Merge Community Church, but I want us to consider what the next step of faith God is calling us to take. And then I think it's also really important to note this. Nehemiah didn't just pray. He didn't just go to the king and ask a question. Nehemiah was ready to follow through. He was available to meet the need that he learned about. And I think we can see as he prays, we know Nehemiah was counting on God to be with him every step of the way. And I'm going to encourage you, if you have some time or if you're not sure maybe where you're going to read next, maybe Nehemiah is a good place to read, because I'm going to kind of do a quick little overview, but we're going to see throughout this book that it's clearly revealed that God is with his people. Nehemiah's prayer is answered. In fact, Nehemiah, he's granted permission to return to Jerusalem, and the wall is rebuilt in only 52 days. Nehemiah then, he spent some time governing in Jerusalem. He spent about 12 years there, and in that time, he's dealing with a lot. He deals with oppression. There were Jews oppressing other Jews. He was able to encourage a repentant people. When the word of God is read by Ezra, he removes foreign enemies from the temple. He reorganizes temple worship according to the Mosaic law. And all of this happens when you take time to read through it. You'll see there are enemies opposing Nehemiah and the rebuilding. There are people who are greatly displeased that someone had come to seek the good of the people in Israel. There are enemies that allege, Nehemiah, beware of him because he's actually plotting rebellion against the king. There are threats made against those who are rebuilding the wall. And yet we see time after time Nehemiah's response. He turns to God, there's prayer, and he continues to prepare to take the next step. In fact, Israel's enemies, they try to remove Nehemiah from the task at hand, but he stands firm. And also, we can just see the integrity in Nehemiah's life. He spent about 12 years governing there, and although it would have been expected, Nehemiah, during that time, he and the people working with him, they never ate at the public expense, which was common practice at the time, because of the fear of God. Nehemiah is one who works with the people. He doesn't buy any land. He actually pays out of his own pocket to try to provide for some of the needs of the workers. And so we see from Nehemiah, we see what it looks like to be a servant leader. And we can even reflect a moment on the words of Jesus from Mark 10. Jesus says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all." And so Nehemiah has accomplished a lot for the Lord. The walls rebuilt, temples reorganized, people are set on the right path through Nehemiah's humble servant leadership. And what this means is that the people can continue to live out the purpose God has for them. The Israelites were meant to be a people to declare the glory of God to the nations, to be a light for the nations, to show people what it looks like to trust God, to surrender to God, to count on his faithfulness. And when you get to the end of the book, Nehemiah, he asks for the Lord's blessing one last time. He says, "Remember me with favor, my God." And you'll find that word "remember." It pops up. We actually read it in verse 8 of chapter 1. It's in this very last verse. It's sprinkled throughout the book of Nehemiah. But I think maybe that word "remember" helps bring into focus another question for us to consider. Does seeing the faithfulness of God spur us on to take the next step of faith? We might even kind of develop a branch off of that question. Maybe it is, are we willing to take that next step of faith because we've seen the faithfulness of God? Because we know, we can be sure, Nehemiah was facing difficulty in this time. And as Christians today, we know there's no shortage of difficulty and darkness that surrounds us. There were people standing against the purposes of God as Nehemiah was rebuilding the wall. And we know that there are those who stand opposed to God's purposes and God's truth today. We've probably noticed that not everyone who says they are a Christian, they want to surrender all. That they want to be completely devoted in all they think and say and do to be a messenger of the gospel, to spread the good news and to make disciples. But I hope we can look at Nehemiah and know that we have an example to follow. Nehemiah takes one step of faith at a time and has confidence that God would be faithful to his promises. And that is still true for us today. God is faithful to his promises. And so my prayer for us is that we will be a people who act with God. We act for God, even though it involves personal sacrifice. I hope we can be a people who trust God one step at a time. And a couple weeks ago, I asked this question, but just thinking about taking that step, acting, just want to bring this back into the conversation. And the question is, how will we act? And the A and the C and the T have a particular meaning in this. As we turn to God, as we think about what our next step of faith may be, how will we act? I just want us to consider, how will we apply, that's the A, apply the truth of God to our lives? Will we take time to reflect on what needs to change? That's the C. Reflect on what needs to change in our lives because of the truth of God. And then go. As we share life with other people, teach someone else the truth of God. We have this example from Nehemiah of what it looks like to act as a response to faith in God. And I am choosing to trust and believe. I hope it's something that we can agree on, that through the power of God, through that next step of faith that we take, through our pursuit of God one day at a time, that we are going to contribute to the building of God's kingdom and God being glorified. I found a quote by a gentleman named Mervyn Brenneman this week in one of the commentaries I read. And This was the quote. He said, "Like many since his time, Nehemiah's greatness came from asking great things of a great God and attempting great things in reliance on him." So, I'll close with this question based on those thoughts. Are we asking great things of a great God and attempting great things in reliance on him? And hopefully as we consider that we would simply continue to turn to God first, to take the next step of faith we're being called to, and to know that God is with us every step of the way. And knowing that, we know as we surrender that God will get all the glory and the honor and the praise that he is worthy of. Amen.